August 1981. François Mitterrand has just become president of France, and he's about to try something that sounds incredible on paper. He nationalizes 36 major companies, raises the minimum wage by 10%, cuts the work week to 39 hours, and adds a 5th week of paid vacation for every worker. The French people are ecstatic. Workers are celebrating in the streets. This is it, right? The dream? Within 18 months, the franc had collapsed. Inflation hit 14%. The government was forced to devalue the currency 3 times. Capital fled the country so fast that France nearly ran out of foreign reserves. What looked like a worker's paradise turned into an economic nightmare that took a decade to recover from. And here's the thing, that crisis was just a preview of what's happening right now. So let me tell you what's actually going on in France today, because it's not just bad, it's structurally catastrophic in a way that most people don't understand yet. The French government is burning through money at a rate that would make even the most reckless American politicians blush. We're talking about a budget deficit of over 5% of GDP, which doesn't sound that dramatic until you realize this isn't a one-time thing, it's been going on for years. Their national debt is now sitting at 112% of GDP, which means France owes more than everything the entire country produces in a year. But here's what makes this different from just normal government overspending. The whole system is designed in a way that makes it almost impossible to fix without literally tearing apart the social contract that's held France together since World War II. My name is David, and I spend way too much time thinking about sovereign debt crises and how governments slowly bankrupt themselves while telling everyone everything is fine. If you're someone who looks at what's happening in Europe and wonders how this affects your investments, your retirement, or just the stability of the global economy, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. By the end of this video, you'll understand the exact mechanism that's destroying France's economy right now. And more importantly, you'll see how this same pattern keeps repeating throughout history and why the people running these systems either can't see it coming or choose to ignore it because fixing it would cost them power. As usual, I need to tell you a story because what's happening in France right now isn't new. It's the same playbook that's destroyed economies over and over again. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Let me take you back to Argentina in the 1990s. After decades of hyperinflation and economic chaos, Argentina had finally found a solution that seemed to work. In 1991, they pegged their peso 1-to-1 with the US dollar. If you had 1 peso, you could walk into any bank and exchange it for exactly $1, guaranteed by law. This was called the convertibility plan. And at first, it was a miracle. Inflation dropped from over 1,000% to almost nothing within 2 years. Foreign investors flooded in, the economy grew. People could plan for the future again without worrying that their savings would be worthless next month. Argentina went from economic basket case to the darling of international investors. The government could borrow money easily because everyone believed the peg would hold forever. But here's what nobody wanted to talk about. To maintain that 1-to-1 peg, Argentina needed to keep enough dollar reserves to back up every peso in circulation. And to keep the economy growing, the government kept spending more and more money on social programs, public sector jobs, generous pensions, you name it. They were paying for all of this by borrowing, mostly in dollars. As long as the economy kept growing and tax revenues kept coming in, they could make the payments. The math worked barely. Now here's where it gets interesting. When you peg your currency to the dollar, you give up control of your monetary policy. If the US Federal Reserve raises interest rates, you have to follow, even if it's terrible for your economy. In the late 90s, the dollar started getting stronger. This meant the peso, tied to the dollar, also got stronger. Suddenly, Argentine exports became more expensive on the global market. Their products couldn't compete. Unemployment started rising. Tax revenues fell. But the government spending, that kept going up. Because politically, you can't cut pensions and public sector jobs when unemployment is already climbing. So they borrowed more to cover the gap. Step 1, the economy slows down. Step 2, tax revenues fall while spending stays high or increases. Step 3, to maintain the peg and fund the deficit, the government borrows more dollars. Step 4, investors start getting nervous and demand higher interest rates to lend more money. But here's the catch. Higher interest rates mean even more of the budget goes to paying interest instead of actual services, which means they need to borrow even more just to make the interest payments on the debt they already have. See the spiral? Why would they keep doing this? Because admitting the peg was unsustainable meant admitting that the entire economic model of the last decade was built on borrowed time. Politicians would lose power. Institutions would lose credibility. So they kept promising everything was fine, kept borrowing, kept hoping something would change. By 2001, Argentina owed $144 billion, and nobody would lend them any more money. The economy had been shrinking for 3 years. Unemployment was 20%. In December 2001, the government announced they were freezing bank accounts. People couldn't access their own money. Riots broke out. The president fled the presidential palace in a helicopter. Within weeks, Argentina defaulted on its debt, the largest sovereign default in history at that time. They abandoned the currency peg. The peso, which had been worth $1, dropped to worth 25 cents. Anyone who had savings in pesos lost 75% of their wealth overnight. Who won? The international banks and investors who had gotten out early, before the collapse. They made their money and left. The wealthy Argentines who had moved their money to dollars or foreign accounts, they were fine. Who lost? Regular working people who had trusted the system, who had saved in pesos, who had pensions denominated in pesos. They lost decades of savings. And here's the kicker. The politicians and central bankers who created this mess, most of them moved on to comfortable positions in international organizations or private sector consulting. They got paid to solve the crisis they created. So what does this have to do with France? Everything. Just like Argentina kept spending beyond its means while telling everyone the system was solid, France is doing the exact same thing, except instead of a currency peg, their constraint is the European Union and the euro. France can't print more euros to inflate away their debt. The European Central Bank controls that. They can't devalue their currency to make exports competitive. They're locked into the euro with Germany. And they absolutely cannot cut spending in any meaningful way without triggering political chaos, because the French economy and social system are built around massive government expenditure that everyone has come to depend on. Let me give you an analogy that makes this crystal clear. Imagine you're a family making $100,000 a year, but you're spending $130,000. To cover the gap, you're putting $30,000 a year on credit cards. At first, it's manageable. You tell yourself it's temporary, that next year you'll get a raise or cut spending. But next year comes, and your spending actually goes up to $135,000 because your kids need braces, the car breaks down, and you've gotten used to the lifestyle. So you borrow more. The credit card debt grows to $50,000, then $100,000, then $200,000. Now a huge chunk of your income goes just to paying the minimum monthly payments on all that debt. You're trapped. You can't cut spending enough to make a dent without giving up the house, the cars, the kids' activities, everything that feels essential to your family. You can't increase income fast enough because you're already working as much as you can. The only option is to keep borrowing and hope something changes. That's France. Except the credit card is the bond market, and the monthly minimums are the interest payments to German banks, Chinese investors, and global pension funds. The braces and car repairs are public sector salaries, pensions for retirees, healthcare, unemployment benefits, and a social safety net that covers almost everything. And the raise that never comes? That's economic growth that France desperately needs but can't achieve because the whole system is too rigid, too expensive, and too dependent on government spending to actually become competitive. Now, let me tell you who the villain is in this story. And it's not who you think. It's not the French government alone, although they're definitely part of it. It's not lazy French workers. That's a stereotype that misses the point entirely. The real villains are the technocrats, the economists, the politicians, and the financial institutions who built this system knowing it was unsustainable and who keep pretending it can continue because they personally profit from the status quo. Here's who benefits from France staying on this path. First, the French political class. Politicians get elected by promising more benefits, more services, more protection. Cutting any of it is political suicide. So they keep the spending going, rack up debt, and pass the problem to the next government. By the time the crisis hits, they're retired with full pensions. Second, the financial institutions that underwrite French debt. As long as France keeps borrowing, banks keep collecting fees and interest. They know the European Central Bank will likely backstop any crisis because letting France fail would destroy the euro. It's a one-way bet. They make money on the way up, and when things collapse, taxpayers bail them out. Third, the European Union bureaucracy. The EU needs France to stay in the system because if France leaves or defaults, the whole European project falls apart. So they look the other way on deficit violations, they provide cheap financing through the ECB, and they pretend the numbers will somehow work out. Why do they do it? Because fixing the problem requires pain, real pain. Cutting pensions, raising retirement ages, reducing public sector employment, reforming labor laws, all of this is incredibly unpopular. The French have rioted over less. Any politician who seriously tries to reform the system gets crushed by strikes, protests, and political opposition. So instead, they manage decline. They borrow a bit more each year, they tweak things at the margins, and they hope they can retire before it all comes crashing down. How do they hide it? Three main tactics. First, they use accounting tricks. They count future projected growth as if it's certain, which makes the deficit look smaller than it really is. They move spending off budget into special funds that don't show up in the main numbers. They sell state assets and count it as revenue instead of what it really is, which is eating your seed corn. Second, they change the metrics. Instead of talking about total debt, they talk about the deficit as a percentage of GDP. And then they argue about whether it's 4.5% or 5.3%, as if that matters when you're already bankrupt. They focus on year-over-year changes instead of absolute levels. So a slightly smaller deficit is treated as success, even though the total debt is still exploding. Third, and this is the most insidious one, they create a culture where questioning the system makes you the bad guy. If you point out that the math doesn't work, you're called a neoliberal who wants to destroy the social safety net. If you suggest reforms, you're accused of hating workers. The debate becomes about values instead of arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't care about your values. Here's the emotional reframe you need to understand. This isn't about French people being lazy or entitled. Most French people work hard, pay their taxes, and play by the rules. This is about a system that was designed decades ago, when demographics were different, when France was more competitive globally, and when debt was much lower. That system is now running on autopilot toward a cliff. And the people in charge either don't see it or don't care because they won't be the ones paying the price. You're not powerless here. You're actually in a better position than most people because you're seeing this play out in real time and you can learn from it. Action step 1. If you have any investments tied to French sovereign debt, either directly or through European bond funds, understand what you're holding. Look at the maturity dates. French bonds due in 2 to 3 years? Probably fine. The country isn't collapsing tomorrow. But 10-year or longer bonds? You're betting that France can somehow fix structural problems that they haven't been able to fix for 2 decades. The yield might look attractive compared to US Treasuries, but there's a reason for that. It's called risk. Check your portfolio today. If you're holding European bond funds, look at what percentage is French debt. If it's more than 10%, ask yourself if you're being compensated enough for that risk. And remember, when things go wrong with sovereign debt, they go wrong fast. Argentina was investment grade until months before they defaulted. Look, here's what most people don't realize about sovereign debt crises. They don't happen gradually. They happen in waves of panic when everyone suddenly realizes at the same time that the math doesn't work. One day, the French government pays 3% interest on its bonds. The next week, it's 5%, then 7%, and suddenly they can't afford to roll over their debt without cutting everything to the bone. It's not a slow decline, it's a sudden stop. And when it happens, capital controls come fast. You won't get a friendly warning email from your broker saying, hey, we think France might be in trouble, so maybe move your money. By the time it's obvious to everyone, it's too late to get out without taking massive losses. Now you might be thinking, but David, the European Central Bank will just bail them out, right? They did it for Greece. They did it for Italy during the debt crisis. Here's the difference. Greece's economy is 2% of the Eurozone. Italy is about 15%. France is 20% of the Eurozone economy. France isn't too big to fail. France is too big to bail. If France needs a rescue, who's going to provide it? Germany's economy isn't big enough to backstop French debt and their own spending at the same time. The ECB can buy some bonds to smooth things over, but they can't solve a structural deficit that requires real political change inside France. This is where it gets really interesting, because what's happening in France is a preview of what's coming to a lot of developed countries. The same demographic time bomb, declining birth rates, aging populations, unfunded pension liabilities, the same political gridlock where any real reform is impossible because it requires taking benefits away from people who vote. The same addiction to cheap debt that seemed free when interest rates were zero, but becomes a death trap when rates normalize. Japan has been playing this game for 30 years, but Japan is unique because they own most of their own debt, and they have a culture of social cohesion that accepts stagnation. France doesn't have either of those advantages. Here's the thing that keeps me up at night. France still has nuclear weapons, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and a military that operates across Africa and the Middle East. When countries with that level of geopolitical importance face economic collapse, they don't just quietly default and reorganize. They make desperate moves. They might try to leave the euro, which would be catastrophic for European unity. They might implement capital controls that trap foreign investors. They might start printing a parallel currency. They might elect extremist politicians who promise simple solutions to complex problems. We've seen this movie before. Weimar Germany didn't turn to fascism because Germans were inherently bad people. They turned to fascism because the economic system had failed them so completely that they were willing to try anything that promised stability and national pride. Now, I'm not saying France is going to become fascist. Calm down. What I'm saying is that economic desperation creates political instability. And political instability in a country as important as France creates ripples across the entire global system. Your retirement account, your job, your cost of living, all of it is connected to the stability of major economies. When people dismiss what's happening in France as just European problems, they're missing how interconnected everything is. Let me give you another angle on this. France's crisis isn't happening in isolation. Look around Europe. Germany, the supposed economic powerhouse, is deindustrializing because energy prices are high after cutting off Russian gas. Their manufacturing is moving to the US and China. Italy has debt at 140% of GDP and a political system that changes governments every 18 months. Spain has 26% youth unemployment. These aren't random problems. This is systemic. The entire European model, high wages, short working hours, generous benefits, strong unions, that model worked when Europe was the manufacturing center of the world and could charge premium prices. Now, manufacturing is in Asia, services can be done remotely from anywhere, and Europe is competing with countries that can operate at a fraction of the cost. France specifically has some unique handicaps. Their labor laws make it almost impossible to fire anyone, which means companies are terrified to hire. Their tax rates are among the highest in the developed world, which drives away entrepreneurs and businesses. Their retirement age was 62, which they just raised to 64 after massive protests. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is moving to 67 or 70. They have 6 million public sector workers, which is insane for an economy their size. That's 1 in 5 workers whose salary comes from taxes. And the productivity? French workers are actually quite productive. But the system around them is so rigid that companies can adapt quickly to changing markets. Here's a specific example that illustrates the absurdity. In France, if you own a retail store with 50 employees and you want to hire one more person to get to 51 employees, you trigger a massive set of new regulations and costs. You have to create a works council, provide additional benefits, comply with more labor rules. The marginal cost of that 51st employee is enormous. So what do companies do? They stay at 49 employees. They turn down business rather than grow. They move operations to other countries. This is death by 1,000 regulations, and every single regulation was created with good intentions to protect workers. But the cumulative effect is an economy that can't create jobs. And the demographic situation, oh man, the demographics are brutal. France's fertility rate is 1.8 children per woman, which sounds okay compared to Italy or Spain, but it's still below replacement level. The population is aging rapidly. By 2050, 1 in 3 French people will be over 60. Who's going to pay for all those pensions and healthcare costs? The shrinking number of young workers? Those young workers who can't find good jobs because the economy is stagnant? Those workers who are already paying 40% of their income in taxes before they even get to sales tax and property tax? The math doesn't work. It's never going to work. And everyone in charge knows this, but they keep pretending that somehow, some way, growth will save them. You know what France needs? France needs a Margaret Thatcher moment. They need someone willing to break things, to face down the strikes and the protests, to say, no, this system is broken and we're going to rebuild it even if it hurts. But Margaret Thatcher almost didn't survive politically, and Britain in the 1980s was in much better shape than France is now. The unions had less power, the debt was lower, and Britain had North Sea oil to help fund the transition. France has none of those advantages. Any French politician who tries real reform will be destroyed. So nobody tries. They just manage the decline and hope they can kick the can down the road one more time. Let me tell you what this looks like in the real world. There's a generation of young French people who are educated, talented, and ambitious. And they're leaving. They're moving to London, New York, Singapore, Dubai, anywhere they can actually build a career and keep more of what they earn. France has a brain drain problem that nobody talks about. The people who could create the companies and pay the taxes to solve this crisis are leaving because the system is stacked against them. And who's left? Retirees who vote for more benefits, public sector workers who vote to protect their jobs, and a shrinking private sector that has to carry the entire weight of this system on their shoulders. I've got a friend who's a software engineer in Paris. He's brilliant, makes a decent salary by French standards. He did the math on his taxes and realized that for every 100 euros his company spends to employ him, he takes home 37 euros after income tax, social charges, and other mandatory deductions. 63% of his compensation goes to the government before he even pays for groceries or rent. And then there's a 19.6% sales tax on most things he buys. He's now interviewing for jobs in Austin, Texas, where he'd pay maybe 25% total tax and make 40% more. Multiply that decision by thousands of talented people every year, and you see the problem. This is the ultimate tragedy of good intentions. Every benefit, every protection, every social program was created to help people, to make life better, to build a more just society. And in the short term, they did help, but nobody thought about the long-term consequences. Nobody thought about what happens when you promise benefits based on economic growth that doesn't materialize. Nobody thought about how you fund all this when the population ages and the tax base shrinks. Or maybe they did think about it, but they figured it would be someone else's problem by the time the bills came due. The financial markets are starting to notice. French bond yields have been creeping up. Credit default swaps, which are basically insurance against default, they're getting more expensive for French debt. International investors are demanding higher returns to take on the risk. This is the early stage of what happened to Argentina, to Greece, to every country that spent beyond its means and refused to reform. The market gives you plenty of warning. The borrowing costs start rising. The warning signs are everywhere. But politicians always think they can manage it, they can smooth it over, they can find one more trick to keep things going. Until they can't. Here's what I think happens next. And I want to be clear, this is speculation, but it's informed speculation based on historical patterns. France muddles through for another 2 to 5 years. The deficit stays high, the debt keeps growing, and they implement minor reforms that don't actually fix anything. Then something breaks. Maybe it's a global recession that crashes tax revenues. Maybe it's political chaos that makes the government unable to pass any budget at all. Maybe it's just bond market vigilantes who decide they're done lending to France at reasonable rates. Whatever the trigger, suddenly France is facing a funding crisis. They can't borrow enough money to cover their spending and roll over old debt at the same time. At that point, they have 3 choices, all bad. Choice 1, massive austerity. Cut spending by 20% or more. Fire public sector workers, slash pensions and benefits. Trigger a depression to get the budget balanced. This is the Greece option. It works eventually, but it takes a decade of misery and you lose a generation of economic growth. Choice 2, leave the euro and print their own currency again. This lets them inflate away the debt and devalue to become competitive. But it's economic nuclear war. The euro collapses, banks fail, there are bank runs and capital controls, international trade freezes up. This is the Argentina option times 10 because France is so much bigger. Choice 3, some kind of European federal bailout where Germany and other countries agree to share France's debt in exchange for giving up sovereignty to Brussels. This is politically impossible right now, but crisis changes what's possible. The problem is, Germany would demand reforms as a condition, and implementing those reforms would trigger exactly the social upheaval that France has been avoiding. None of these options are good, and this is why you need to be paying attention to this, because when one of these scenarios plays out, the ripple effects hit everything. The euro weakens or collapses, which affects the dollar, which affects US interest rates, which affects your mortgage and your retirement savings. European banks that hold French debt face losses, which means credit markets seize up, which means companies can't borrow to expand or even to make payroll. International trade gets disrupted because nobody knows what currencies are worth or who can pay their bills. We saw a mini version of this in 2011 during the Greek crisis, and Greece is tiny. France is the world's 7th largest economy. What can you do about it? Beyond checking your bond holdings, think about diversification in a way that accounts for geopolitical risk. If you've got all your money in US or European assets, you're concentrated in systems that are all facing similar demographic and debt problems. Maybe that means adding some exposure to Asia, to commodities, to assets that hold value even when fiat currencies are in crisis. I'm not telling you to buy gold and canned food and move to a bunker, but having some portion of your wealth in things that aren't dependent on the stability of over-leveraged governments seems pretty reasonable right now. Also, understand that when these crises hit, there are opportunities. The best time to invest in Argentina was right after the collapse, when assets were cheap and the country had nowhere to go but up. The best time to invest in Greece was 2015, when everyone thought it was doomed. If you've got capital and you're positioned correctly, sovereign debt crises create buying opportunities. But you have to be ready. You have to understand what you're looking at. You have to be able to move fast when everyone else is panicking. The broader lesson here is about sustainability. Every system, whether it's a personal budget, a company, or a country, has to balance income and expenses over time. You can borrow for a while to smooth out rough patches or invest in growth, but eventually the math has to work. France, and a lot of countries like France, have been running on borrowed time for decades. They've made promises they can't keep, created obligations they can't fund, and assumed that growth would solve everything. It hasn't. It won't. The American lesson in all this? Don't get complacent. The US has its own debt problems, its own unfunded liabilities, its own demographic challenges. We're not as far down this road as France, but we're on the same path. Social Security, Medicare, these are the same kind of pay-as-you-go systems that work great when you have lots of young workers supporting fewer retirees and fail catastrophically when that ratio inverts. The national debt is $35 trillion and growing. We're still okay because the dollar is the reserve currency and the US economy is more dynamic than Europe's, but those advantages aren't permanent. Watching France circle the drain should be a warning about what happens when you prioritize short-term political wins over long-term fiscal reality. Everything I've just told you is already baked in. The demographics aren't going to suddenly reverse. The debt isn't going to magically disappear. The political will to make painful reforms isn't going to materialize out of nowhere. France is going to hit a crisis. It's just a question of when and exactly how bad it gets. And when it does, a lot of people are going to lose money, lose jobs, lose their sense of economic security. But some people, the people who saw it coming and positioned accordingly, they're going to do fine. They might even profit from it. Not because they're evil, but because they understood the pattern, they paid attention to the math, and they didn't let wishful thinking cloud their judgment. That's what separates people who build lasting wealth from people who get wiped out every time there's a crisis. It's not about being smarter. It's about being honest about reality, even when reality is uncomfortable. It's about seeing the pattern in France and recognizing that pattern is playing out in different forms all over the world. It's about making decisions based on math and history instead of hope and political promises. If there's one thing you take away from this video, let it be this. When the math doesn't work, eventually reality reasserts itself. Always, no exceptions. And France is running out of time before reality sends that bill.